So today's webinar will highlight strategies to mitigate issues around on-street parking. And as a matter of fact, parking management has not been viewed as a tool to help cities achieve a more sustainable transport system. So in today's session, we'll begin with a deep dive on the on-street parking pricing guide co-authored by our first panelist, ITDP's Dana Yanoha, who is a research manager at ITDP Global Team. The parking guide is available for download in English and in Portuguese, and I'll drop all the links in the chat shortly for everyone. Then we'll have a deep dive into a case study from the city of Fortaleza, presented by Antonio Ferreira Silva, who is a public servant at the municipal government of Fortaleza and an engineer who has been working with the municipality for over 30 years in the area of mobility planning. And after formal presentations, we'll open up the space for a brief Q&A. So please make sure you are using the Q&A box to add your questions. So now I can just stop my screen sharing and pass it on to Dana.
Great, thanks so much, Ivana. Welcome everyone. Thanks so much for joining today. I'm really excited to share with you some of what we found when we were putting together this on-street parking pricing guide, and very excited to see how that connects with Antonio's work in Fortaleza as well. So you can go to the next slide, Ivana. Great. So ITDP has over a decade of experience working with cities on parking, and we've really been trying to establish a link between parking reform and a more sustainable mobility system. So we've done a lot of work with cities to think about reallocating parking space to more efficient, equitable uses. And we've done this in a lot of different regions, from Mexico City to Beijing to the US, and a lot of that work helped to inform the on-street parking pricing guide that we are focusing on today. You can go to the next slide. So thinking about a little bit of context for on-street parking reform, it's probably not a surprise that many cities and countries have been experiencing rapid motorization in recent decades. And that increase in driving has led to some negative outcomes like air and noise pollution, traffic-related injuries and deaths, and more inequitable mobility system. A higher demand for driving also means more demand for storing vehicles, and that's happening a lot of the time in our precious public space. So managing parking is a really powerful tool to ensure more equitable use of public space. But what does that mean? What do we mean by equitable use of public space? That means that high volume, low emitting, and affordable modes are getting priority on the street. So that means public transportation, cycling, and walking. And you can click again, Ivana, it's just going to bring up some photos. So the other important contextual element here is how the COVID-19 pandemic has really highlighted the need for more and better spaces for walking and cycling, and for gathering outdoors more broadly. In many of our cities, we were able to experience what was possible when space is reallocated in ways that work for more people. So we saw more outdoor dining spaces, expanded sidewalks, temporary cycle lanes, and effective parking management can really help not only to maintain these types of interventions, but also to scale them. So ultimately, if you come away from this webinar with just one idea, it should be that more efficient parking management enables cities to prioritize valuable urban space for people, and that results in more equitable and healthy communities. Next slide. So like Ivana mentioned, I'll be doing sort of a deep dive today into this idea of effective parking management. There's a lot more detail in the parking pricing guide that I'm not going to have time to get into today. So I do encourage you to take a look at that guide if you want to learn more about any of these topics. So for today, the idea for this presentation is really just to give you a sense of what to be thinking about if you're looking to take up on-street parking reform, but maybe you don't know quite where to start. Next slide. So a good place to start is actually aligning parking reform with citywide goals. I think Ivona mentioned parking really hasn't been viewed in a lot of cases as a tool to achieve a more sustainable transportation system. A lot of times parking management and transportation planning happen separately, and in some cases in conflict with one another. And then that's set against a backdrop of these long-standing trends where local governments and businesses are supplying lots of space for roads and for parking. And that, of course, has led to a subsidization of vehicle use and vehicle storage. But there are some cities that are sort of leading the way in shifting how they're thinking about parking and really using parking reform as a way to take back space from cars. So a great example is in Paris. Paris has been working to remove private cars from its city center, specifically as a means of combating air pollution. So Paris has set a goal to remove at least 60,000 on-street parking spaces downtown, and is working to reallocate that space for more public uses and for low emission and shared modes like public bike share stations and bicycle parking. And then Mexico City similarly implemented its parking program about a decade ago as a way to reduce neighborhood traffic congestion. So they really focused their parking program in these congested neighborhoods and saw a lot of success with that approach. You can go to the next slide. Step 2 is choosing a structure for parking management. So what this means is thinking about who is going to be responsible for designing and implementing the parking program, who is going to operate the parking program, and what form that operation will take, and also how to develop contracts to ensure that operators are providing a really high quality service. So this is also a good time for cities to think about their own capacity to manage parking operations, day-to-day parking management, and contracting. These are all kind of complicated and multifaceted tasks. So cities with limited capacity might actually prefer to sort of streamline some of these, maybe just work with a single private operator in order to minimize the number of contracts that are needed and actually reduce administrative overhead and financial risk. But then over time, as capacity to manage parking grows, it's important to reevaluate some of these decisions around operations and reassess whether the city actually has the ability to take on more financial risk or direct operation of the program over time. Next slide. So on-street parking management should really be centralized under one entity. We call this the implementing agency. This might be a municipal department within the government or something more like a parking authority, which operates a bit separately from the government itself. But regardless of the type of implementing agency, centralizing management under just one entity really helps to ensure a more comprehensive vision. It helps to establish accountability, and it also helps to ensure that there's connection and collaboration happening with other transport decision-making in the city. So a good example of this is in Budapest. So Budapest has a municipal department called the BKK Center for Budapest Transport. And that is a municipal entity that oversees all of urban transport planning and implementation. And of course, that includes parking management, but that municipal department sort of took over parking management from a private operator, which had been responsible for parking in the past. But a big critique of that private operator was that a lot of what they were doing was really isolated from other urban transport departments. So having this more centralized operations within the municipal government enabled more collaboration across the board, and also enabled the city to develop an integrated transport budget and sort of reallocate some of the parking revenues back into that broader budget. You can go to the next slide. So next, you want to think about the sort of form of operations. And the first option here is direct operations. So this is where the city or the parking authority is directly responsible for managing the day-to-day operations of the parking program. In this scenario, the city really has complete control over parking operations, and they're also receiving all of the revenue that's being generated from the parking program. This is beneficial for the city in a lot of ways. It can help the city align the parking program with other city services. It can be branded similarly and establish a lot of association with other city services. But this structure, of course, requires a lot of capacity among city staff. And the city is assuming the most financial risk. They are covering the costs of both the capital expenditures and operating costs in this scenario. You can click again, Ivona. The other option is private operation, and there's sort of two avenues you can go down typically under private operation. The first is using a management contract. This is where the municipality or the parking authority issues a contract to a private operator who's responsible for the day-to-day management of the system. But the revenues are still coming in directly to the city, and then the city is using those revenues to pay the operator. In this scenario, the city still has some control over day-to-day system operations, but this can be really beneficial for cities that maybe don't have the experience or the technical knowledge to operate the whole program. So they're getting the benefit of an experienced parking service provider. There is some risk around service provision, especially if the contract isn't set up in a way where operators are incentivized to provide good service. So it's really important to build a really solid contract in this type of structure. And then the second, you can click again, Ivona, is concession. So this is the most hands-off approach. This is where a municipality is basically handing over all of the responsibility for the parking program to a private operator. And the operator is really running the show. So in this scenario, the revenues are coming in to the operator, and then a share of that is shared with the municipality. And this can be really beneficial because the city is taking on the least amount of financial risk. But there may be some downsides where the city is sort of missing out on a potentially large revenue stream. But in most cases, the concession operator is really incentivized to run a good program and even invest money back into the system as a way to maximize their own profits from the program. So you can go to the next slide, Ivona. So a good example of this is in Rosario, Argentina. Rosario uses a concession with an operator called Tránsito Rosario that's been in place since 2009. And this operator invested recently in 2018 about 45 million pesos in the system to update the parking meters, which are actually owned by Tránsito Rosario. And they did this as a way to improve compatibility between the parking meters and the city's transit card. And they saw that as an opportunity to increase revenue and parking fares. So that was an opportunity for them to invest in the program, but also as a way to kind of capture potential increased revenues. Next slide. This third step is thinking about the financial model. So of course, estimating things like capital costs, operating costs, and revenues. You can go to the next slide. So a priced parking program can actually generate pretty significant revenues beyond what it costs to operate the program, especially over time. And a lot of cities direct a share of that surplus revenue to sustainable transport projects and other types of public space improvement work. And this is a really good way to build support for the parking program if people are seeing some of this surplus revenue being reinvested back into their neighborhoods and making their streets and public spaces safer and more livable. Next slide. So a good example of this is in Moscow. In Moscow, their parking revenue is reinvested at the district level. This is a really good practice, this idea of reinvesting at sort of a hyper-local level. So in Moscow, each district has this sort of executive body that helps to decide where that reinvested revenue is going to go, which type of projects are going to receive funding. And so that money has gone to public space and streetscape improvements, enhancements for improving access for people with limited mobility, and other types of these kind of local upgrades. Next slide. It's important to think about developing an outreach plan and engaging with local stakeholders. So this type of outreach plan really helps to communicate the vision of the parking program and any new parking rules with the public. It's really important that this type of outreach and engagement is happening throughout the whole process of planning and implementing the parking program. And there's really three key pieces of this outreach plan. The first is community engagement. This is about using things like focus groups to involve local stakeholders in the process of conceptualizing and planning the system. The second is education. This is really about making sure that the public understands new parking rules and that that's communicated clearly. And then the last piece is marketing and branding. So this is really about aligning the parking system with a broader vision and really promoting parking reform as a way to achieve these broader city goals around livability. Next slide. A good example of this idea of marketing and branding of parking reform is in Mexico City. So when Mexico City launched its Eco Park program back in 2011, 2012, it really purposefully used this sort of green and blue color scheme and included the word eco in the name of the program, Eco Park. And that was to communicate this idea to the public that Eco Park was part of a larger environmental initiative that was trying to improve air quality and other types of public health outcomes. And Eco Park also had an outreach plan that included a lot of different strategies for kind of getting the word out about the program. So they sent flyers to residents to let them know about parking changes that were going to be coming to their neighborhood. They talked to people on the street and distributed information directly to people in public places. And then they also launched a website where all of this information was sort of housed in one place and could be easily accessed by everyone in the city. Step 5 is enforcement, thinking about developing an enforcement plan that really anticipates enforcement challenges that might come up. So There's a couple of different things to think about here. The first is enforcement agents, how many you might need, what the responsibilities of these enforcement agents will be, whether you're going to use any sort of technological or physical solutions to support enforcement, and then any other penalties or sort of means of encouraging compliance with the parking system. Next slide. So a really important part of any enforcement plan is establishing the city's ability to issue penalties for illegally parked vehicles. And it can be helpful to set up sort of a hierarchy for penalties where the most severe violations are carrying the highest penalties, and the least severe violations are carrying much lower penalties. Penalties and thinking about parking fines in particular should really be set high enough that they're deterring violations, or in other words, it's just easier to comply with the parking rules. But these penalties shouldn't be set so high that drivers feel like the system is just set up to take advantage of them. So other things like payment plans to relieve some of that economic burden from parking fines can also help to build trust and compliance with the system. And then there's other penalties aside from fines, which can help to support enforcement by deterring parking violations. Some examples are wheel clamping and towing, which you can see here. And then there are also some physical barriers like bollards and high curbs that can support enforcement by physically preventing vehicles from accessing spaces where they shouldn't be parking. So things like bollards that prevent parking on sidewalks or other sort of no parking areas. Go to the next slide. Technical solutions are also a way to support enforcement. These are also interesting because they can help to do some other things like reducing corruption and allowing for better, sort of more granular data collection on how the parking system is working and how people are using it. A lot of times technological solutions can also improve payment compliance because they enable enforcement agents to be more efficient and responsive to parking violations. But of course, many of these pose additional costs, which would also need to be considered in the financial model. You can go to the next slide, Ilona. So the last step in the process is evaluation. Of course, it's important to think about indicators that will be used to evaluate the impacts of the parking program and also to enable the tracking of progress towards these broader public goals. This is an opportunity to evaluate capacity. So thinking about whether it might make sense to continue along with the same operating structure. Maybe the financial model has changed, or maybe there's additional funding available to implement some additional technological solutions that are going to support enforcement. So this evaluation process can really help to inform adjustments to the program so that it can grow and improve year to year. So there are really two key levels at which evaluation needs to happen. The first is evaluating the parking operator. This evaluation is typically a review of the performance metrics that are built into the operating contract. And meeting or exceeding some of these metrics might trigger bonuses for the operator. Or on the flip side, if operations are not meeting certain standards, there could be some penalties that come into play for the operator. So it's just really important to get a sense of how the operator is approaching the program and how successful that is year to year. And then you can go to the next slide, Ivana. And then the second level of evaluation is happening at the system level. So this includes reviewing operations, but it goes beyond that to also include other areas like payment, enforcement, And of course, taking a look at the financial model. These type of financial indicators will be really important to demonstrating the long-term financial health of the system. So taking a look at these regularly is really helpful to get a sense of where things are financially. So this type of system evaluation should happen annually, and the results should be made publicly available. This really helps to minimize suspicions about things like misuse of revenues, and it can just really help to increase public confidence in the system. Go to the next slide, Ivana. So this is my last slide here, just thinking about some other elements that can support a successful parking program. We talked a little bit about road space reallocation as on-street parking becomes more efficient. Some of the on-street spaces may be able to be replaced with other uses like bike share. There's other traffic reduction measures that can help to support a broader sort of focus on reducing demand for driving that the parking program can fit into. Thinking about demand-based pricing, so varying parking rates depending on location or time of day to make those spaces more efficient. And then finally, flexible curb management. So thinking about all of the uses of the curb beyond just vehicle storage and prioritizing those uses based on things like volume and efficiency. So things like shared pickup drop-off zones, flexible loading zones, parklets, and other uses of the curb beyond just vehicle storage. So that is the end of my presentation. So I guess I'll turn it back over to you, Ivana.
Great. Thank you so much, Dana, for this very thorough overview of the parking pricing guide and also sort of walking us through the different steps from planning to evaluation. So that is really useful. So let's move on to Antonio. And just a reminder that there is a interpretations function available, so you can switch to the English channel when the time is right.
Rotating parking in Brazil, in Fortaleza, is called Zona Azul or Blue Zone. Next. So why the Zona Azul? Why the Blue Zone? Because it democratizes the use of parking lots. We also have rotary parking lots and more people using public spaces. On the right side of the screen, you can see that vertical type of standardization of downtown. Next. In Zona Azul, on the left, you can see the printed materials that we used up to 2018. This paper was forged many times, and you can read where it says Digital Zona Azul. The first parking lots, parking spaces in Fortaleza started out in the 70s. In downtown Fortaleza, where most stores were located in downtown Fortaleza. In 2002, the municipality became responsible for traffic, and in 2002, the AMC, or the Fortaleza municipality, started to make decisions and to determine the payment, how much end users would have to pay. In June 2018, the Fortaleza mayor's office took it to municipal level and they applied law 10,752 of 2018. They say that rotary parking lots will be used to, if bikes are no longer used. Next, no, not next yet. In August 2018, there was another plan that was to implement the digital Zona Azul in order to control the entire process and all of the expenses. It's great to think that in up to December, we underwent the digital to transfer the paper from paper to digital. Next. Next slide. This is a map of the city of Fortaleza, and you can see that most of the parking spaces in the blue zone are located in the central area of Fortaleza. Although there are parking spaces in the south in the micro centers, which is what we call Necesina Paragaba Hotel. And in 2018, the system got fully digital. As you saw in the timeline from August to December, many years later, after that, I was giving it a try and different applications are being used. And you can see the different apps that we use in the different stores where the digital card can be found. Next. Next, please. How do you use the Zona Azul? The first step is a step for digital Zona Azul. We are no longer using physical cards, but we're using blue digital cards. And first of all, you have to find for a parking space with the signage of the city. The second step is to buy the digital app. I mean, it's an app. And step number 3 is to by activating the digital card, the user receives a confirmation email. Next. What are the advantages of the digital card? First of all, we can save time. You don't have to be less than simple. And you could also choose among different companies with different payment forms, and you can get the individual family credit or through the different members. Next. What about surveillance in digital Zona Azul? You can see the police officer reading the license plates. So there's surveillance right there. And there's another way of oversight involves the next, please. Through video monitoring, we can do surveillance of the Zona Azul in Fortaleza. We have 600 cameras that are also used for at least once a month surveillance. Next. Next, please. Next, please. Okay. Zona Azul in numbers. Today, there are 6,100 parking spaces in Fortaleza. With the digital Zona Azul, during the, there are more than 7 million cards that have been sold and over 260,000 users with 6,100 parking spaces available now. Next. Let's continue with the numbers. In 2021, over 1 million cards were sold, 14,120 parking tickets, which accounts for around 4.9 million reals collected for card sales and infractions. Next. Next. Let's keep on going with the numbers. In 2018, when Zona Azul started using a paper card, it was the average monthly collection was around 201,000 reals, which accounted for 24% and 76% came out from selling cards. In 2019, ever since the digital zone started operating, we more than doubled the average monthly collection. As you can see in 2019, it increased and it went from 24 to 35% and 65% for sales. In 2020, 406,000 reals were collected. Out of that, 53% accounted for infractions collections and 47% because of card sales. In 2021, 411,000 reals due to the inflation and 53% for card sales. In 22, it was 120,000 reals, which is 41% that comes from collection and 59% has to do with sales. Next, please. The forecast for Fortaleza is to reach 7,000 parking spaces by the end of 2024. And I would like to underscore that the city of Fortaleza is working with the Economic Development Agency, with the Transit Municipality. We're all working together when the different studies are made, because we're also conducting studies with other companies such as IGF, NGO, in order to know if it's possible to make a concession in the Zona Azul. In order to seem viable, we need to make to work under the concession or granting scheme. Next, please. The Zona Azul resources are entirely devoted to promoting cycling, which means that the money collected in the blue zone is directly reinvested in public transportation in highly sustainable transformation systems by implementing new public and shared bike spaces. Right? And you know that there are 416.4 kilometers of infrastructure. So next, please. This is the Zona Azul and the shared cycling system, which is called Bicicletar. This is December 2014 when the bicycle stations got implemented. In April 2015, there were 15 Bicicletar stations. And from then on to December, we moved up to 50. And in August 2016, we spent up to 18 systems within the city of Fortaleza that sponsors the not 18, the 80 sessions. In August 2008, the regular law and a decree was issued establishing that Zona Azul resources will solely be dedicated to improving the bicycle lanes. And the government made a public call for money for fund transfer. In 2019, resources were used in creating new stations for shared bike rides. And as of April 2020, we started to implement resources that are northbound, south northbound, and this is just an example. Before I came, before we got to this point, in December 2020, we moved up to 192 public parking spaces for bicycles. So as the user guide refers to Fortaleza's ticket, from Monday through Saturday, there's 1 free hour in the system and an hour and a half for pants, so you can use the sharing and free escape system. To underscore that the 92 substations have been compared in integrated management systems over the specific instrument, and the instruments or the stations nearby, as well as the BLT stations. And so one of the some of the neighborhoods that use that system more are those who live in the periphery, who can also use their bicycle, leave it at a CRT study and start with the individual. In the Zona Azul is also a synonym of flexibility. It broadens the number of parking spaces and its solutions reach the National Traffic Council. Next, please. And there's a third area devoted to people with disabilities, with the elderly, and the blue zone has different usage times according to each regions by themselves, and different usage times according to the region must meet the local demands, which are for 1, 2, or 5 hours. The cost of a card for the digital Zona Azul card is 15 reals, and the digital Zona Azul card for 2 hours costs $5, and that 5 hours, 2 hours without time extensions. Next. Zona Azul is also a synonym of flow and load and unload. And this happens, our goal is to reduce the flow of vehicles and trying to find parking spaces in more demanding spaces. Next. Rotary is also helping us out significantly. And Zona Azul has to do with
600 câmeras de vigilância integrada à Secretaria de Segurança e Defesa.
Public security is monitored through the security camp this, and it also helps us create a safety public health programs. Next, please. Next. This is the end of my presentation. And these are Pedro Rivera's words. He used to be an architect. And he says that the public space has a duty to serve the city's collective being, and it means to negotiate permanently. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Antonio, and thank you for ending your presentation with this beautiful quote. I couldn't agree more. So we have only about 7 minutes for a very, very quick Q&A. And I apologize in advance if we don't have time to dive into all the questions, but I'll pick a few. So perhaps I'll start with you, Dana. And there's a question regarding the allocation of space on streets for all types of users. So using space for parking often hinders other uses, such as reserved bus lanes, dedicated cycling infrastructure, and so on. So how do you decide what uses should be given a priority?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think you know, we used to, in a lot of cities, just default to providing that space at the curb for on-street parking. And a lot of times that parking wasn't priced. So, you know, maybe one car is parked in a space on, you know, a main city street for the entire day. And that means maybe one person has access to that space. So that doesn't seem like the most efficient use of that space when we think about potential other uses. So like bus lanes or bicycle lanes, like the person who asked this question brought up. You know, there's a lot more people on a bus that's pulling into a bus stop than the one person who is driving that car that's parked there all day. So, you know, curb space is really limited in most cities, and so we have to prioritize it for the most, you know, high volume and low emitting modes that we have. So thinking about, you know, just getting out of this idea that just all of the curb space needs to be used for parking, and then thinking about, you know, what else it can be used for is kind of the first step. And I think, yeah, the idea of efficiency and equity really comes into play here when we think about other modes that can use that space aside from private vehicles.
Great, thanks so much, Dana. So maybe a question now for Antonio. There's a question here from Washington regarding basically transitioning from informal parking systems to more formalized. Of course, like such as in the example of Zona Azul, this requires many agencies being on board, establishing policies. So Washington is asking here, with the example of informal parking wardens, which are called, I guess, flanelinhas in Portuguese. They're common in Rio, for example. So what are the strategies to adopt to transition from such a level of informality, which sometimes is even connected with corruption linked to the police force, to a more organized parking authority? Do you have an answer to that, Antonio?
Vocês viram que antes do
I hope you were able to see that we used to give out a digital physical blue card. In the South, everything was working fine, but the risk of fraud was pretty big. With the implementation of the digital blue card, if you opened up, took on a loan, I think there's an area where there's improved control of money collection based on how accessible the population can get. And the digital blue card, as you saw in the presentation, brought certain boundaries for 2019. And it's basically because of what came out of paper. And in digital, there's no longer fraud.
Thanks, Antonio. And that definitely is an issue. And I think some of those may be touched on in our previous webinars also. There's a link in the chat that I added, but we will add it to a wrap-up email to all that registered. And I have, I guess, the last question to both of you. There are a couple of questions, one in the chat and one in the Q&A regarding basically transitioning the responsibility of providing parking and charging for parking to private sector, where this is a good idea to allow entities like banks, shops, restaurants, or institutions to both provide parking and charge for it. In some cases, this is seen as injustice, right? Not everyone would have access to such parking, but in some cases, maybe it could control access to the supplies. So do you have some thoughts on that, Dana?
Yeah, I'm not sure I gathered the crux of that question, but I think I would be hesitant to move forward with a policy like that. I think the centralization of parking within the municipal government is really important. I think if we're having businesses or individual entities just providing parking without sort of an overarching structure or sort of set of goals, can kind of go off the rails a little bit. So I think there just needs to be some coordination between what those stakeholders like businesses or other commercial users are looking for, what their needs for parking are, what they interpret their customers' needs for parking is, and then communicating that with the city and kind of coming to some consensus around how parking is provided.
Got it. And Antonio, do you have some thoughts on private sector providing and charging for parking?
Também não deu para entender bem a pergunta, né?
I
Mas
couldn't get your question properly, but Fortaleza, the modeling studies, the engineering modeling studies that we're conducting at the legal, commercial, and operational level will help us better determine which spaces can be allocated to businesses. And remember that Fortaleza has expanded the sidewalks to have more spaces in lieu of traffic lanes, to provide more spaces to pedestrians. And those are, that's the downtown Fortaleza area that requires so much public space. And I'm grateful for the guide that you're giving out, because it will help us diversify these spaces. And there's another approach. Individual transportation is done by Fortaleza, would will improve the transportation system by not only focusing on bicycles, but on trains too. So by having a multi-modal or multi-modals active channels can be better understood when there's more equity in how you divide or how you break down the public space. It also depends on individual type of transportation.
Got it. That's actually a great answer, that cities should think about prioritizing public space and public transport modes. So thank you so much for emphasizing that, Antonio. So this brings us really to the end of the session. Thank you so much for everyone who attended, who also presented, of course, Dana and Antonio, for sharing your insights today. So I encourage everyone to subscribe to ITDB's email and check our social media for upcoming exciting events, such as the one that I just shared in the chat. Next month, our webinar is going to continue the dialogues with the city of Bogota, the 2022 Sustainable Transport Award winner, and we'll be talking with transport specialists and decision makers about the amazing things that Bogota has done and how they've got there. So I encourage you to sign up. And today, again, I thank you, Antonio, and the city of Fortaleza for sharing your insights, and Dana. And see you again soon. Thank you.
Thank you. Take care.